Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 152. I'm Enigmius, and today we've got a lot of stuff going on the Heracles. We've been very busy, focused on texture, kind of adding visual interest to the exterior of the ship, and also taking care of some structural details that we had to keep in mind based on what we saw in the last episode and what we needed in order to call the ship complete. We're going to start with one of those main structural elements, and that was the thrusters, the lateral thrusters on the starboard side. We're looking at them right now. We had originally 8 thrusters in a line, just in a straight line with a shroud on the front end here. It was a little bit larger than what you see now, and when I thought 8 thrusters would be enough, it was good. I was happy with it. When I realized it probably wouldn't be enough, I decided to push it a little bit and add more. We added 6 more in total. And that kind of put us in a position of asking ourselves how we were going to place those additional 6 thrusters in a way that actually made sense. And I had originally thought of putting it more towards the back of the ship, sort of somewhere in that area there. But I decided instead to redo the shrouds, redo the way that the original thrusters were placed. Instead of having a row of 8, we would have 7. We would have them sort of taper off in towards the hull, towards the end, and then we would have another 7 up top, slightly offset. You see this is the first one here relative to the one there. Same shroud design, also offset, carrying all the way down, tapers in towards the hull, towards the back. Ultimately, I'm relatively happy with it. There's one thing that I'm kind of debating right now. It's an internal debate that's raging in my puny little head. I kind of feel like in order to be fully satisfied with this, I need to move the whole thing down a couple blocks, because you can see we're basically right up to the plate that's holding these silos right here on the very top. And then underneath, we've got this big open area that doesn't have anything. So either we have to put something in this open area so it doesn't look so open anymore, or we have to move all of these down a couple of blocks so that it looks a little bit more centered top to bottom. And then we can say, we're good, we're done. One or the other, I think, is what's going to end up happening before the blueprint goes out to the rest of the world. Just because right now I feel like it's just a little bit off in this particular part of the ship. I expanded this section here. Originally it was, I think, 3 tanks wide, the way that we've got them set up. And I added a little bit more just because after we redid the shroud, we had like a big open area here. So just by expanding this outward, it kind of filled that in a little bit. And I started messing around with different textures for the pipes. Originally we were using this very basic sort of ridged texture, which I quite like for the pipes. It does a really good job, I think. But I decided to mess around with some others and see what we get. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the placement of the cylinders kind of changes sometimes depending on what direction you're looking at it relative to what direction you're placing it from, etc., etc. So you get some where you place the cylinder and then you texture it, and this is what you get. This is sort of the middle of the texture, and then it has the seam where the ends meet on the back side. And then other times you get the seam and the center of the texture is on the other side. Probably could fix this just by repositioning the cylinders, removing them and placing them differently to get rid of it and kind of have the same thing all the way down. But I decided, yeah, it's not that important. Kind of leave it. It's a little bit different. And the whole idea is just kind of getting a feel what some of the options look like. You can see here's another different texture that we've used here. And it still helps reinforce the idea that it's round. You know, it's definitely a cylinder, it's a pipe, it's got some interesting textural elements going on. Kind of fun to play around with. If we continue towards the back here, this panel has been here for a while. Just basically it's a raised panel relative to what was going on before we added it. And then we've got that indent around the inner edge, and then we've got it raised again here. And then on the exposures, we've got the green sort of paint to kind of add a little bit of contrast. What I ended up doing was carrying the concept around to this curve here and using various different blocks so that we could have that half block exposure that we paint with the green, and then we've got this section around the outside edge that's just indented, a half block. And I like it. I like the way that it looks. We did the ridged texture on it so that it's a little bit different. It's not just a flat shiny black. And then down here we did basically the exact same concept, only the underside here was shaped differently in the original sort of pod. You can see it kind of comes down and then it goes back up and then it goes that way. So we just kind of went with the flow and followed it around the way that it wanted to go on its own. Did the green on the exposures And ultimately, I'm mostly happy with it. I feel we're kind of at the edge of what we can expect to get out of the green with the contrast. Any more green in this and it would be starting to take over. So I've kept that in mind for future texture things around other places on the ship, that we just kind of don't want to make... We want to make sure that the green doesn't have an opportunity to take over. Up here, we put this very simple sort of textural thing in here. We've got some 22.5 degree slopes, back to back, so to speak. You can see slope here, down the middle, and then just very simple border all the way around with the green and the exposures here. Up here, however, is a little bit more involved. And this, again, is just adding texture to what was otherwise a dull gray panel, even if it was sort of curving in a weird sort of way. And what this consists of is these black sections that come out from the hull and actually are in the middle, completely detached from the hull. You can get in behind them, sort of like this. They go all the way down and then they come back towards the hull in this area here, so that they're attached on both ends, but they're detached from the hull everywhere else. And then in order to emphasize the detached nature of this, I had to put these little troughs into the panels so that you could see the difference between the two areas. You could definitely see the gap. And then between those troughs, we had these flat sections. So I put some textured stuff on the flat sections just because. And overall, duplicating it all the way down, pretty happy with it. Again, it's just something interesting that catches your eye and you say, what is that? And you look at it for a little while, you say, hey, that was kind of neat. And then you go and move on with your life. It's not a functional sort of thing, but it was kind of fun to build and a little bit interesting. But I decided if I were to paint any of these green, this would be pushing the limits of what we could get out of the green from the lesson that I learned down there. So I decided, rather than painting any of these green or trying to make them work with the wall slopes attached to them for the exposures, which is sometimes a really fun and interesting way to do it, I decided to just do these weird little shapes at the bottom of the divider between the troughs, using the wall blocks, so we can paint them a flat black in this case with the green exposure, and also using the really flat slope block so that we get this very, very slim angular exposure that we can paint green. And it's just a little bit of detail to break things up a little bit. It's a design that I could take or leave. I'm not, celebrating its existence, but at the same time, I'm not unhappy with it. I was just basically messing around to see what I could come up with. In terms of the starboard side of the ship, having already mentioned the dilemma over this area here and exactly how we're going to handle it, I could see possibly putting something in here. And when I say something, probably guns. It seems like a good spot for them. We've got this area here that could use something, maybe something here. And then, of course, this section here is just asking for something a little bit more substantial than something like that. So there'll probably be more here by the next episode, just to kind of carry on with what we've been doing all the way towards the back of the ship. And then I'll be revisiting these pods in the back, not in terms of what I should change structurally, but what I can do in terms of paint, colors, and texture, just to kind of bring them a little bit closer to what's going on with the rest of the ship. We've got gray, black, and green, and on all the stuff back here is gray. So we'll kind of take a look at that and see what we can do about it. But that's not all. That's not the only places that I've been working. I really wanted to get the thrusters finished. I wanted to get them in place and carry on with all the other things once the thrusters were done. So I came over here with that in mind, and one of the first things I did was just add more texture. You can see here, similar to what we were doing on the other side, only instead of having sections that kind of stick out a little bit and then have little troughs in between them, like we do so often on the other side, we've got these little ridges instead. Kind of happy with it. It's another alternative in the grand scheme of things. Didn't take much to build, it didn't take much to conceptualize, and it doesn't take much in terms of materials either. We've used the vented texture in between because it seemed to make a little bit of sense. And it works well. In the space that we had to try and fill something in, I think it did pretty well. Down here, we've got the shroud around the lift thrusters that we put in the gap between the hangar and the rest of the ship. And you can see there's all the thrusters. We built the shroud very, very simple. We've got sort of like an indented texture here, that carries around to the side of the ship all the way down and continues on this side. Very simple, very straightforward. I feel like it's going to get some sort of texture or paint between now and the time the blueprint comes out. But at the same time, based on where it is, I don't feel it's absolutely necessary because you don't really see it most of the time when you're working around the ship doing whatever you happen to be doing. You're not really seeing this. So we could go either way with it. I'm not too concerned. And then again, continuing with what we had on the other side, it's that sort of raised section. You can see we've got some blocks specifically oriented, depending on how you prefer to say that, to stick out from the hull the way that it was. And then we can start doing like a little indentation here. And then we have these raised so that we've got an indentation and these are raised from that indentation. But these middle pieces are still below the main ridge here, if that makes any sense. So we've got three different heights of things going on. We've got the highest here, the lowest here, and then the middle, like that. And it continues all the way down to here, but it will probably continue farther all the way down to the end. Just because we've got the space, it's something that's easy to do, especially now that I've got the profile in place. And I like the way that it looks. It's cheap, it's easy, and it doesn't take long. So that's kind of a bonus. If we come over to the other side, you can see we've done the exact same thing, only we've done from literally the very back of the main hangar section all the way to the front before it transitions to the widest part. And then we had these pods where the landing gears are that were kind of in the way. So rather than trying to build these around it, I just decided to have stop on either side, have a little gap there. We may put something in there, we may not. And then continue on the other side. We have that little ridge built out from the original hull. We don't have the lowered section, but you can still see that this is indented slightly relative to that ridge, and then it just goes all the way down. It's textured with the basic ridged and riveted texture that we've been using so many other places around the ship. All the way up to here. I mean, it's simple and straightforward. I really like the way that it looks. And I would say this is about 80% complete, this section here. It just needs a little bit of something in order to say that it's absolutely fully complete. But it won't take much. Here we've got the thrusters. We just keep going and going. We have 14 thrusters on the other side. We had originally 8. We added 6. So we've got 14 here on this side, just to keep everything relatively similar in terms of the handling characteristics of the ship. In a straight line, we've got 8, and then there's a gap. Then we've got 6. I didn't want just one great big long row of thrusters on this side of the ship, where you're probably going to be seeing these thrusters far more often than the lift thrusters that we had in between. So I decided we'd have that little gap there, and then we built a shroud around it, both to protect the thrusters and kind of carry forward this idea that we're actually trying to build a ship that's interesting and not leaving these big sections where we've put in the least amount of effort possible, and it shows. So the shroud is not especially complicated. It's not 100% complete. We're probably going to have at least one indented section somewhere, likely down the middle, and then we'll have the exposures where we can put a little bit of green. Probably going to be painted black by the time we're all said and done. The front section, where it starts and goes this way, as you can see, it's 2 blocks thick combat steel until it gets to this part here where it tapers off, and then it goes down to 1 block thick. And again, it's just texture, adding texture and making things look a little bit different. Carrying down, and then we've got this raised section here. Again, just texture. Probably also be painted black, and then those exposures will be painted green. On the top side, you're seeing the beginning of the structural concept that's going to be used all the way down to the end, and then also on the underside as well, where there's currently nothing. And this is kind of an optical illusion, I have to say. What we've got here, and we'll actually move over to this one because it's a little bit more straightforward. We've got a 22.5 degree slope, the 2 blocks that make up the slope. Then we've got the beam blocks that I've used in various different places, usually on either side of a walkway, so that we have some place to put rails and have it look like everything is all part of one piece and everything makes sense. And then you have, on the other side, another beam, when realistically you can't put one beam here, and then in the same space put another beam. So what I did was I put the 22.5 degree regular blocks, and then I put the 22.5 degree wall blocks down the side so that I could attach the beam to the wall blocks. At first glance, it looks like they're part of the same block, and we've got this little guy on the edge. But in reality, it's actually the wall blocks, little narrow wall blocks that allow us to do that and make it look like it's all part of one thing, and then we continue it all the way down until we have no more place to put them on this level. And of course, the underside, we had to have a little green just to make everything fit the way that everything was fitting. And again, very, very simple, straightforward. It's not expensive. It's not especially time consuming. And if we continue it all the way down to the end, we'll have a unified sort of design, especially when we do the same thing on the underside. We'll finish off a little bit of detailing here above those long strips of the black texture detail. And then the last thing we can look at, the last part of the ship that I've been working on, is this side part of the main hangar section. And the whole idea here was to add a little bit of texture to it, a little bit of visual interest, some guns, and use the same concept of the gun rails that we saw in the last episode, where we basically build up a little structure, and then we have these big fat cylinders, 2 sets of them running down the length of the hangar, and then we have blocks in the middle where we can put guns. Pretty simple, straightforward. I like the look of it. I like the idea. And I felt like it would work well on this side of the ship as well, because it lets us have these sort of textural elements down the side and then build the rails out from that, attach our guns, and all of a sudden this is a fairly well defended part of the ship. We've got 6 pulse lasers now on this side of the ship. And these little things here, when the ship is powered, these will have little holographic displays in this open area between the forks, so to speak, top and bottom. And it was just to add a little visual interest to what was going on. This platform that I made for the guns themselves, I don't even remember why I wanted to have it 4 wide with the 2 block wide thing here. I just knew that after I did it that way, in order for the guns to fit the way that I might have liked them to, I either had to have them offset like this, I had to trim it down so that it was only 3 blocks wide, or I had to have something on this side just to kind of balance everything off. And I decided to go with something on this side and use something that I hadn't used on the exterior of the ship before, which is these little holographic panels. So we've got all of those in place. And then this textured bit that I added, we had these black beams from the last episode that we saw, and we kind of wrapped them around to the side of the ship, and then we added these little narrow pieces, 22.5 degree slope, and then we inverted one of the 22.5 degree blocks so that it breaks away from the hull. It's got that little slope moving away from the hull. The half blocks, and then basically duplicates the same profile going in that way. And then again, those little wall blocks, the super narrow slope blocks that we can place and then paint them black. It looks like they're part of everything. It's got kind of an interesting profile going on, and then we've got these little exposures that we can paint green that aren't overwhelming, they aren't too much, and we just continue all the way down. And we've got this, again, just texture. Something on the outside of the ship that looks a little bit more interesting than the original gray panel. So we're making quite a lot of progress, and it's happening fairly quickly, largely because we don't have any major sort of structural things that we're working on. We have enough to keep us busy structurally that I can't really rush the texturing and painting just for the sake of saying that the ship is now done. But I would suspect that there will be 2 more episodes maximum before the ship is done, and then the episode following will be the blueprint episode where we do the final tour and everything is taken care of and done, and you guys can start messing around with this ship in your worlds, which I think will be the most fun part for those of you who have stuck around for this length of time as we work on it, is to actually start to put your ideas into place on the ship and hopefully have some fun with it. So if you want to be notified about the next and future videos in this series, as always, you can subscribe to my channel. You can follow me on social media. Links for social media are in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.